Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of rural Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1923 settled over Rappahannock County like a heavy shroud, bringing with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to penetrate not just the walls of the old houses scattered throughout the valley, but the very souls of those who called this remote corner of Virginia home. It was a season that would forever mark the beginning of what locals would later refer to, in hushed whispers behind closed doors, as the Caldwell incident. The Caldwell property sat approximately 8 miles southeast of the county seat, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense stands of oak and hickory trees. The house itself, an imposing 3-story structure built in the late 1800s, commanded a view of the entire valley from its perch on a modest hill. According to county records, the property had been in the Caldwell family since 1887, when Thaddeus Caldwell purchased the 340 acres from a tobacco farmer named Josiah Blackwell, who had fallen on hard times following a series of failed harvests. Thaddeus Caldwell was not a man who courted attention or sought the company of his neighbors. At 47 years of age in 1923, he had earned a reputation throughout Rappahannock County as a man of few words and fewer social graces. Those who had occasion to conduct business with him described a tall, gaunt figure with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely white hair that he kept meticulously groomed, despite his otherwise austere appearance. His wife, Cordelia, was equally reclusive, though neighbors occasionally spotted her tending to a small garden behind the house or hanging laundry on lines that stretched between 2 ancient maple trees. The couple had lived alone in the house for nearly 4 decades, their isolation broken only by the quarterly visits from Barnabas Drummond, a traveling preacher who served the scattered homesteads throughout the region. Drummond would later provide crucial testimony about his final visit to the Caldwell property, though his account would not emerge until decades after the initial investigation had been closed and filed away in the basement archives of the county courthouse. According to postal records maintained by the Rural Delivery Service, the Caldwells received very little correspondence, usually limited to official notices from the county tax assessor and occasional letters from a bank in Richmond, where they maintained their accounts. The postman, Ezekiel Moorfield, noted in his daily log that he had not been required to deliver anything to the Caldwell mailbox for over 6 weeks prior to the events of October 1923. Moorfield's delivery logs, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, reveal a pattern of increasing isolation that had characterized the Caldwell household throughout the early 1920s. Where once they had received monthly letters from what appeared to be relatives in other parts of the state, these communications had gradually diminished until they ceased altogether by the spring of 1922. The last personal letter delivered to the property was postmarked from Norfolk and bore the return address of someone identified only as C. Whitmore, though no further information about this correspondent has ever been located in surviving records. The isolation of the Caldwell property was not unusual for rural Virginia in the 1920s, where many families lived miles from their nearest neighbors and maintained minimal contact with the broader community. However, even by the standards of the time, the Caldwells' level of seclusion was remarkable. They employed no regular help, grew most of their own food, and appeared to have severed virtually all social connections beyond the most basic commercial transactions necessary for survival. The first indication that something was amiss came from Delphine Ashworth, who operated a general store in Flint Hill, the closest thing to a town center in that part of the county. Mrs. Ashworth maintained a detailed ledger of her customers' purchasing habits, both for business purposes and because, as she would later admit, she found comfort in the predictable patterns of rural life. The Caldwells visited her store on the second Tuesday of every month, arriving just after dawn and purchasing the same items: flour, sugar, salt, lamp oil, and whatever seasonal vegetables she had available. Mrs. Ashworth's ledger books, donated to the County Historical Society in 1958, provide a fascinating glimpse into the economic and social patterns of the rural community during the early 20th century. The Caldwells' purchases were consistently modest but regular, suggesting a household that lived frugally but was not in financial distress. Their payments were always made in exact change, counted out carefully from a small leather pouch that Thaddeus carried in his coat pocket. What struck Mrs. Ashworth as particularly noteworthy was the couple's behavior during these monthly visits. They spoke only when necessary to conduct their business, never engaged in the casual conversation that characterized most customer interactions, and seemed uncomfortable when other customers were present in the store. On several occasions, the Caldwells had waited outside until other patrons had completed their business before entering the store themselves. When October's second Tuesday passed without their appearance, Mrs. Ashworth initially assumed that illness or inclement weather had delayed their trip. The roads in that part of the county were notoriously difficult during autumn rains, and it would not have been unprecedented for elderly residents to postpone non-essential travel during challenging weather conditions. However, when November arrived with no sign of the couple, she mentioned their absence to her husband, Mordecai, who served as one of 3 elected constables for the county's rural districts. Mordecai Ashworth was a practical man who had held his position for over 15 years, dealing primarily with disputes over property lines and the occasional incident involving excessive drinking during harvest festivals. His approach to law enforcement was measured and conservative, reflecting both the limited resources available to rural authorities and the community's general preference for resolving problems through informal mediation rather than official intervention. The constable's reluctance to investigate every irregularity in his neighbor's routines was reinforced by his understanding of the cultural norms that governed rural Virginia communities in the 1920s. Privacy was valued above almost all other considerations, and the right of individuals to live as they chose, without interference from neighbors or authorities, was considered fundamental to the social contract that bound these scattered settlements together. However, Mrs. Ashworth's concern about the Caldwells was amplified by reports from other residents about an unusual smell emanating from the direction of the Caldwell property. These reports came from several sources, including hunters who had been tracking game in the area and a timber cruiser who had been surveying forest land for a potential logging operation. The smell was consistently described as sweet but unpleasant, reminiscent of overripe fruit but with an underlying odor that suggested decay or decomposition. The convergence of these concerns eventually prompted Constable Ashworth to make the 8-mile journey to check on the elderly couple, though he approached this responsibility with considerable reluctance. His personal philosophy emphasized the importance of respecting his neighbor's autonomy, and he was acutely aware that unexpected visits from law enforcement officials were rarely welcomed in rural communities where self-reliance and independence were cultural imperatives. The road to the Caldwell house had always been challenging, particularly during the autumn months when fallen leaves created a slippery surface over the hard-packed earth. The route wound through dense forest for most of its length, emerging into cleared areas only occasionally to provide glimpses of the surrounding valley. During his approach to the property, Ashworth later reported that the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the very atmosphere around the Caldwell land had grown thick and oppressive. The smell that several residents had mentioned became increasingly apparent as Ashworth drew closer to the house. What had been merely noticeable at a distance became overwhelming as he reached the cleared area surrounding the dwelling. The odor was not consistent with normal agricultural activities or household waste, nor did it correspond to the natural processes of decomposition that would be expected in a forest environment during the autumn months. When Ashworth reached the house on November 18, 1923, he found the front door standing slightly ajar, despite the cold weather that had characterized the previous several weeks. This detail struck him as particularly odd, given the couple's well-established pattern of maintaining their privacy and securing their home against unwanted visitors. The Caldwells had always been meticulous about such matters, and the sight of their front door hanging open suggested either carelessness that was completely out of character or circumstances that had prevented them from following their usual routines. The constable called out several times from the front porch, identifying himself and requesting permission to enter the premises. When he received no response, he waited for several minutes before finally deciding that his responsibility for public safety justified entering the house without explicit invitation. This decision was not made lightly, as violations of domestic privacy were considered serious breaches of community trust that could have lasting consequences for law enforcement officials who overstepped their authority. The interior of the house was immaculately maintained with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. The main living area showed evidence of recent occupancy, but everything was arranged with the same precise order that had characterized the Caldwells' approach to all aspects of their domestic life. Furniture was positioned exactly as it should be. Personal items were stored in their designated places, and surfaces had been cleaned recently enough to show no accumulation of dust. The kitchen contained the remnants of what appeared to be a partially prepared meal, with vegetables still sitting on the cutting board and a pot of water sitting cold on the wood-burning stove. This scene suggested that food preparation had been interrupted suddenly, though there were no obvious indications of what might have caused the disruption. The vegetables appeared fresh, indicating that they had been cut within the past few days. But the absence of any cooking odors or heat from the stove suggested that the meal preparation had been abandoned before any actual cooking had taken place. A systematic search of the house revealed that all of the Caldwells' personal belongings remained in place. Their bedroom showed no signs of disturbance, with clothing still hanging neatly in the wardrobe and personal items arranged precisely on the dresser. The bed had been made with the military precision that Thaddeus Caldwell brought to all of his activities, and there was no indication that it had been slept in recently. What struck Constable Ashworth as particularly odd was that both of the Caldwells' coats still hung on hooks near the front door, despite the increasingly cold weather that had characterized the previous several weeks. This discovery was particularly troubling because both individuals were known to be sensitive to cold temperatures and would not normally venture outside without appropriate clothing during the late autumn months. The constable's written report, filed with the county clerk on November 20, 1923, noted several peculiar details that would later prove significant to investigators who would revisit the case decades later. Every clock in the house had stopped at exactly 3:17, though Ashworth could find no obvious explanation for the simultaneous failure of multiple timepieces. These included a grandfather clock in the main hallway, a mantel clock in the sitting room, a kitchen clock, and a bedside alarm clock, all of which had apparently ceased functioning at precisely the same moment. The basement door, which led to a stone-walled cellar beneath the kitchen, was secured with a heavy iron padlock that appeared to be relatively new, despite showing signs of recent use. This discovery was particularly puzzling because previous visits to the house had never revealed any indication that the Caldwells locked interior doors or took unusual security precautions within their own home. The basement had traditionally been used for storage of preserved foods and household supplies, and there would normally have been no reason to restrict access to this area. Perhaps most disturbing was Ashworth's discovery of a leather-bound journal in Thaddeus Caldwell's study, open to an entry dated October 15, 1923. The entry was brief but unsettling. "The sound from below has grown constant now. Cordelia refuses to acknowledge what we both know must be done. The promises made in youth become the chains that bind us in old age. Tomorrow we will descend together and face what we have fed with our silence. The journal itself was a substantial volume bound in dark leather and containing what appeared to be several hundred pages of entries in Thaddeus Caldwell's careful handwriting. The entries spanned several decades, beginning with mundane observations about farm life and seasonal changes, but gradually evolving into increasingly cryptic references to obligations and bargains that defied easy interpretation. An entry from 1889, written in the same precise script but showing the confidence of a much younger man, mentioned the Eastern Chamber and the necessity of maintaining the covenant that binds us to this place. Mimastami. The language was formal and deliberately obscure, suggesting that Caldwell was recording information that he did not want to make easily accessible to casual readers. A passage from 1903 described visitations during the dark hours and the importance of keeping faith with what lies beneath our feet. These references were accompanied by detailed observations about lunar phases and seasonal changes, as if Caldwell was documenting patterns that had significance beyond their obvious meteorological implications. Later entries revealed increasing anxiety about the sustainability of whatever arrangements the Caldwells had made. A passage from 1915 expressed concern about the growing hunger and questioned whether our offerings remained sufficient to maintain the balance. The tone of these entries suggested that Thaddeus Caldwell was struggling with doubts about decisions made earlier in his life, decisions whose consequences he was only beginning to fully understand. The most recent entries in the journal painted a picture of two people under extraordinary psychological pressure. Caldwell wrote repeatedly about sleepless nights, strange sounds emanating from the basement, and a growing sense that time was running out for whatever solution he had been attempting to implement. A passage dated October 1st, 1923, described Cordelia's increasing resistance to our obligations and expressed fear that her refusal to participate may bring consequences upon us both. Constable Ashworth's investigation was hampered by the limited resources available to rural law enforcement in 1923. Without access to modern forensic techniques or investigative procedures, he was forced to rely on his own observations and the testimony of neighbors, most of whom had little direct knowledge of the Caldwells' daily activities. The couple's deliberate isolation meant that there were no regular visitors, no household staff, and no close friends who might have information about their final days. The county sheriff, Lucius Pemberton, was summoned from the main administrative center to assist with the investigation. Pemberton was a political appointee whose qualifications for law enforcement were questionable, but who had the advantage of connections with state authorities who might be able to provide additional investigative resources. However, his examination of the property was perfunctory at best, focusing primarily on determining whether any obvious crimes had been committed rather than attempting to understand the circumstances of the couple's disappearance. Sheriff Pemberton's approach to the case reflected the broader attitudes of rural law enforcement during the 1920s, when missing persons cases involving elderly individuals were often assumed to be the result of natural causes or mental confusion rather than criminal activity. The absence of any signs of forced entry, theft, or violence at the Caldwell property reinforced his inclination to seek simple explanations for what appeared to be an unusual but not necessarily suspicious situation. After conducting a brief search of the surrounding forest, during which no trace of the missing couple was found, Sheriff Pemberton concluded that the Caldwells had likely wandered off into the woods, possibly suffering from the mental confusion that sometimes afflicted people of advanced age. This explanation was convenient because it required no further investigation and placed responsibility for the disappearance on factors beyond the control of law enforcement authorities. The official determination was recorded as accidental death presumed, and the case was closed after a brief search of the surrounding forest failed to locate any trace of the missing couple. The Caldwell property was sealed and placed under the custody of the county until such time as legal heirs could be located or the appropriate waiting period for a death declaration could be satisfied. However, the community's acceptance of the official explanation was far from universal. Several residents who had lived in the area for decades questioned whether the Caldwells were physically capable of the kind of wilderness wandering that would be necessary to explain their complete disappearance. Both individuals were known to have mobility limitations that would have made extended hiking through rough terrain extremely difficult, if not impossible. Minerva Blackstone, who had worked as a seamstress for several families in the area, later revealed that she had encountered Thaddeus Caldwell on 2 separate occasions during the weeks preceding his disappearance. According to her account, Caldwell had appeared increasingly agitated and had made several references to settling old debts and honoring commitments made in darkness. These phrases had struck her as unusual because they were uncharacteristic of Caldwell's normally reserved communication style. More significantly, Mrs. Blackstone claimed that during their final conversation, which occurred in late September 1923, Caldwell had pressed a small brass key into her hands, instructing her to give this to whoever comes asking the right questions. When pressed to explain what constituted the right questions, Caldwell had simply stared at her with what she described as eyes like empty wells before walking away without another word. The exchange had been sufficiently disturbing to leave a lasting impression on Mrs. Blackstone. Though she had initially hesitated to report it to authorities because she was uncertain about its significance and did not want to betray what might have been a private confidence. The key itself was unremarkable in appearance, made of brass and showing signs of age and frequent use, but bearing no obvious identifying marks that might indicate its purpose. Mrs. Blackstone's decision to keep the key rather than immediately turning it over to investigators would later prove to have far-reaching consequences for understanding the Caldwell case. The key remained in her possession for over 40 years, carefully wrapped in a piece of silk cloth and kept in a small wooden box on her mantelpiece. During this time, she mentioned its existence to no one, not even her own family members, feeling bound by Caldwell's cryptic instructions about giving it only to someone who asked the appropriate questions. The criterion of asking the right questions was never clearly defined in Mrs. Blackstone's mind, though she had developed an intuitive sense that she would recognize the appropriate recipient when the time came. This vague directive left her in the position of serving as an unwitting guardian of what might be crucial evidence, waiting for circumstances that she could not clearly articulate or anticipate. Her attempt to mention the key to Constable Ashworth during the initial investigation was unsuccessful, because Ashworth was focused on collecting basic factual information about the couple's disappearance rather than exploring the more speculative possibilities that Mrs. Blackstone's story seemed to suggest. When she began to describe her final conversation with Caldwell, Ashworth interrupted her to ask about more concrete details, such as the exact date and time of the encounter, and whether she had observed anything unusual about Caldwell's physical appearance or behavior. Mrs. Blackstone's natural reticence, combined with Ashworth's obvious discomfort with her story's more mysterious elements, resulted in her decision to abandon her attempt to share the information. She concluded that Ashworth was not the person Caldwell had intended to receive the key, and she resolved to wait for someone who would demonstrate a deeper understanding of the questions that needed to be asked. The community's response to the Caldwell disappearance reflected broader patterns of behavior that characterized rural Virginia society during the 1920s. There was a general reluctance to speculate publicly about events that involved private family matters, particularly when those events suggested possibilities that challenged conventional understanding of normal human behavior. Conversations about the case were typically conducted in private settings among trusted friends and family members, with the understanding that certain topics were not appropriate for general discussion. This culture of discretion served important social functions in maintaining community cohesion and protecting individual privacy. But it also meant that potentially important information about the Caldwell case was not systematically collected or preserved. Details that might have been significant to a comprehensive investigation were shared only within small circles of confidants, and much of this information was lost when the individuals who possessed it died without passing it on to subsequent generations. The psychological impact of the case on individual community members varied considerably based on their level of involvement and personal susceptibility to stress and anxiety. Some residents reported experiencing persistent unease when traveling past the sealed Caldwell property, while others claimed to have entirely forgotten about the incident until reminded by occasional references in local conversations. For those who lived closest to the Caldwell property, the impact was more pronounced and lasting. Several neighbors reported changes in their daily routines that persisted for years after the disappearance, including reluctance to venture outside after dark, increased attention to securing doors and windows, and heightened awareness of unusual sounds or smells that might indicate trouble. These behavioral changes were typically attributed to general concerns about safety and security rather than specific fears related to the Caldwell case, but the timing and persistence of these modifications suggested a deeper level of psychological impact. The seasonal recurrence of the mysterious odor that had first alerted residents to potential problems at the Caldwell property became a source of ongoing anxiety for the immediate neighborhood. Each autumn brought reports of similar smells emanating from the direction of the sealed house, though investigators were never able to identify a clear source or explanation for these phenomena. Some residents speculated that the odors were related to natural decomposition processes occurring within the abandoned building, while others suggested that they might be connected to underground springs or geological features that were not fully understood. The persistence of these reports led to several unofficial investigations by curious neighbors and local amateur detectives. Though none of these efforts produced conclusive results or significant new evidence about the original disappearance. The sealed condition of the house prevented detailed examination of its interior, and the legal restrictions on accessing the property limited the scope of any informal investigations that might have been conducted. It was not until 1964 that the key would finally serve its intended purpose, when a young historian named Isadora Fairfax arrived in Rappahannock County as part of a state university project documenting rural Virginia communities and their oral histories. Dr. Fairfax had initially planned to spend only a few days in the county, collecting stories about early settlement patterns and agricultural practices. But her interview with the elderly Mrs. Blackstone led her down an investigative path that would consume the next 3 years of her academic career. Dr. Fairfax's credentials were impressive for someone still in her early 30s. She had earned her doctorate from the University of Virginia with a dissertation on social isolation in Appalachian communities, and her published work on the psychological effects of geographic isolation had earned recognition from several academic institutions. Her research methodology combined traditional archival work with extensive fieldwork, including detailed interviews with community members and systematic documentation of cultural practices that were disappearing as rural areas became increasingly integrated into broader economic and social networks. The Virginia State University project that brought Dr. Fairfax to Rappahannock County was part of a broader initiative to document rural communities before modernization and population migration altered their traditional characteristics beyond recognition. The project was funded by a combination of state educational funds and federal grants designed to preserve American cultural heritage, and it involved researchers from several academic disciplines working in coordination to create comprehensive records of rural life during the mid-20th century. Dr. Fairfax's specific assignment involved conducting oral history interviews with elderly residents who could provide first-hand accounts of community life during the early decades of the 20th century. Her approach to these interviews was systematic and thorough, involving multiple sessions with each subject and careful documentation of not only the information provided, but also the cultural context within which that information was shared. When Mrs. Blackstone, then 86 years old, finally revealed the existence of the brass key during her third interview with Dr. Fairfax, the historian immediately recognized its potential significance to understanding not only the Caldwell case, but also the broader patterns of community response to unexplained events. The fact that Mrs. Blackstone had preserved the key for over 40 years while waiting for someone to ask the right questions suggested a level of cultural sophistication and psychological complexity that challenged conventional assumptions about rural community dynamics. Dr. Fairfax's decision to pursue the implications of Mrs. Blackstone's revelation was not made lightly. Her academic training had emphasized the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and focusing on documented historical facts rather than pursuing speculative theories that might not be supported by sufficient evidence. However, the systematic nature of Mrs. Blackstone's account, combined with her obvious sincerity and the physical evidence provided by the key itself, suggested that this was an opportunity to illuminate aspects of rural community life that were rarely accessible to academic researchers. The process of obtaining permission to examine the long-sealed Caldwell house required several months of negotiations with county authorities, state historical preservation officials, and legal representatives for the property. The house had remained under county custody since 1923, with no clear resolution of its ownership status due to the absence of identifiable heirs and the ambiguous legal status of the missing couple. This administrative complexity meant that multiple agencies had potential jurisdiction over decisions about access to the property. Dr. Fairfax's academic credentials and institutional support eventually proved sufficient to overcome bureaucratic obstacles, but the permission she received was hedged with numerous restrictions and conditions designed to protect both the integrity of potential evidence and the liability interests of the various agencies involved. She was required to conduct her examination in the presence of county representatives, to document all of her activities photographically, and to agree that any artifacts or evidence discovered during the investigation would remain under official custody rather than being removed for independent analysis. The house had deteriorated significantly during its 4 decades of abandonment. Weather damage had compromised the roof in several places, and moisture had caused extensive damage to the interior walls and flooring. However, the basic structure remained sound, and many of the original furnishings were still in place, though covered with dust and debris and showing signs of rodent activity and general decay. Dr. Fairfax's initial examination of the main living areas confirmed many of the details that had been reported in Constable Ashworth's original investigation. The arrangement of furniture and personal belongings suggested that the house had been abandoned suddenly, without the kind of systematic preparation that would normally accompany a planned departure. However, 4 decades of environmental exposure had obscured many of the more subtle details that might have provided additional clues about the circumstances of the disappearance. The basement area proved to be the key to unlocking the mystery that had puzzled investigators for over 40 years. The heavy padlock that had secured the basement door in 1923 was still in place, though it showed significant corrosion from decades of exposure to moisture and fluctuating temperatures. More importantly, Dr. Fairfax's careful examination of the basement walls revealed the existence of a secondary lock that had been hidden behind a removable panel constructed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding stonework. The brass key provided by Mrs. Blackstone fitted perfectly into this hidden lock, which operated a mechanism that allowed a section of the basement wall to swing inward like a door. Behind this concealed entrance was a narrow passage that led to a chamber carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house's foundation. The chamber was approximately 8 feet square and just tall enough for a person of average height to stand upright. The walls showed evidence of careful excavation work, with tool marks still visible in the stone surface despite the passage of decades. The precision of this work suggested that the chamber had been created by someone with considerable skill and patience rather than being hastily improvised to serve an immediate need. The walls had been finished with a technique that left them remarkably smooth and regular, indicating a level of craftsmanship that was inconsistent with casual or amateur excavation. The chamber's contents provided the first concrete evidence about the nature of the activities that had apparently been conducted in this hidden space. Along the eastern wall, Dr. Fairfax discovered what appeared to be an altar of sorts, constructed from a large flat stone supported by smaller rocks, arranged in a precise geometric pattern. The surface of this stone was stained with what laboratory analysis would later confirm to be organic matter, though the exact nature of this material could not be definitively determined due to its age and deterioration. Arranged around the altar were several objects that suggested the chamber had been used for some form of ritualistic activity. These included a collection of animal bones arranged in patterns that appeared deliberate rather than random, candle stubs that had been burned down to mere puddles of wax, and a series of metal implements whose function was not immediately apparent to the investigators. The metal objects showed signs of regular use and careful maintenance, indicating that they had served important purposes in whatever activities had been conducted in the chamber. Perhaps most significant was Dr. Fairfax's discovery of a second journal, this one bound in what appeared to be animal hide and secured with a leather thong. Unlike the journal found in Caldwell's study, this one contained entries written in multiple hands, suggesting that it had been maintained by different individuals over an extended period of time. The handwriting analysis conducted by experts at the university confirmed that at least 4 different people had contributed to the journal, though their identities could not be determined from the writing samples alone. The earliest entries in this underground journal were dated 1847 and appeared to be written in a dialect of English that reflected the speech patterns of mid-19th century rural Virginia. These early passages describe the establishment of what was referred to as the Covenant and the construction of the sacred chamber, beneath what was then a much smaller dwelling on the property. The language used in these entries was formal and ceremonial, suggesting that the writers were documenting events that they considered to be of great significance. According to these historical entries, the chamber had been created by a group of individuals who had fled religious persecution in the eastern part of the state and sought to establish a community where they could practice their beliefs without interference from civil or religious authorities. The exact nature of these beliefs was not clearly articulated in the journal, but references to communion with the earth spirits and feeding the hunger beneath suggested practices that deviated significantly from conventional Christian worship. The entries indicated that these early settlers had developed a complex theological system that incorporated elements of pre-Christian spirituality with their own interpretations of biblical teachings. They apparently believed that the earth itself possessed a form of consciousness that required regular acknowledgement and propitiation, and that failure to maintain proper relationships with these terrestrial forces could result in disasters affecting the entire community. The construction of the underground chamber was described as a necessary component of their religious practice, providing a space where the community could conduct ceremonies that required privacy and protection from the scrutiny of outsiders who might not understand or approve of their beliefs. The chamber was conceived as a liminal space existing between the world of human activity above ground and the realm of natural forces below, where communication between these different spheres of existence could be facilitated. The journal's entries indicated that the original community had disbanded by the 1860s, with most members leaving the area during the disruptions of the Civil War. However, the property and its underground chamber had been maintained by a succession of caretakers who inherited both the land and the obligation to honor the covenant established by the original settlers. These caretakers were apparently chosen based on their willingness to continue the religious practices that had been established by the community's founders, rather than through conventional inheritance or financial transaction. Thaddeus Caldwell's name first appeared in the journal in 1887, the same year he had purchased the property from Josiah Blackwell. The entries in his handwriting initially expressed uncertainty about his inherited responsibilities and considerable anxiety about his ability to fulfill obligations that he only partially understood. However, these early doubts gradually gave way to acceptance and even enthusiasm for what he came to understand as his duty to maintain the traditions established by his predecessors. A particularly revealing entry from 1889 described Caldwell's first participation in what was euphemistically referred to as the October feeding. The description was sufficiently vague to avoid providing explicit details, but it clearly involved some form of offering or sacrifice performed in the underground chamber during the autumn months. The language used suggested that these ceremonies were elaborate and carefully choreographed, requiring extensive preparation and adherence to specific protocols that had been established by previous generations. Subsequent entries revealed that these rituals became an annual obligation for the Caldwell family, performed in isolation and secrecy according to traditions that stretched back decades to the original community. The ceremonies apparently involved multiple components, including the preparation of specific types of food offerings, the recitation of formulaic prayers or invocations, and the performance of physical activities that required the participation of both Thaddeus and Cordelia Caldwell. The psychological toll of these activities on both members of the Caldwell family became increasingly apparent in journal entries from the early 1900s onward. References to sleepless nights and whispers from below suggested that the couple was experiencing significant stress related to their ritualistic obligations, stress that manifested itself in physical symptoms as well as emotional disturbance. Thaddeus wrote repeatedly about headaches and digestive problems that seemed to coincide with the approach of the annual ceremonies, while Cordelia apparently suffered from what would today be recognized as severe anxiety attacks. An entry from 1912 explicitly stated that Cordelia had begun experiencing what Thaddeus described as episodes of extreme agitation during the weeks leading up to each October ceremony. These episodes were characterized by persistent fear, inability to concentrate on normal household activities, and physical symptoms including trembling, shortness of breath, and episodes of nausea that had no apparent medical cause. Thaddeus's descriptions of his wife's condition revealed both genuine concern for her well-being and frustration with her increasing reluctance to participate in what he considered their shared religious duty. The entries from this period also revealed growing tensions between the couple about the sustainability and appropriateness of continuing the practices they had inherited. While Thaddeus maintained that their obligations were sacred and non-negotiable, Cordelia apparently began questioning whether the ceremonies were actually necessary or whether they might be causing more harm than benefit. These disagreements created ongoing strain in their relationship and contributed to the social isolation that characterized their later years. The final entries in the Underground Journal written in Thaddeus Caldwell's increasingly erratic handwriting, painted a picture of two elderly people driven to desperation by decades of psychological pressure and irreconcilable differences about their inherited responsibilities. The last legible entry, dated October 14, 1923, contained only the words, "She refuses to continue. The hunger grows stronger each year. We are too old to flee, too weak to fight. Only one path remains." Dr. Fairfax's investigation also uncovered physical evidence that suggested the fate of the Caldwell couple, though this evidence was circumstantial and could not be definitively proven without more extensive analysis than was permitted under the terms of her research agreement. Chemical analysis of soil samples from the chamber floor revealed elevated levels of phosphorus and calcium, consistent with the decomposition of organic matter over an extended period. However, the age and degradation of these materials made it impossible to determine their exact origin or composition. More concrete evidence came from Dr. Fairfax's examination of the chamber's construction and layout. The eastern wall contained a cavity approximately 6 feet in length and 2 feet in depth, carefully sealed with stones and mortar that appeared to be consistent with building materials used throughout the house. The mortar showed signs of relatively recent application, possibly dating to the 1920s, based on its chemical composition and weathering patterns. The cavity's dimensions and construction suggested that it had been designed to serve as a repository or storage space for materials that required protection from moisture and decay. The careful sealing of the opening indicated that whatever had been placed inside was intended to remain undisturbed for an extended period, possibly indefinitely. However, Dr. Fairfax was not authorized to open or examine the contents of this sealed space, as county authorities determined that such investigation would require more extensive legal procedures and potentially involve law enforcement agencies. Ground-penetrating radar examination of the chamber floor revealed additional anomalies that suggested the presence of buried objects or materials beneath the stone surface. These anomalies appeared to be organized in patterns rather than randomly distributed, indicating that any buried materials had been placed deliberately according to some systematic plan. However, the limitations of radar technology and the restrictions on excavation meant that the nature and significance of these buried materials could not be determined during Dr. Fairfax's investigation. The historian's research extended beyond the physical evidence found at the Caldwell property to include extensive interviews with elderly residents who had memories of the missing couple and the events surrounding their disappearance. These interviews revealed a pattern of community knowledge and complicity that had never been acknowledged during the original investigation, suggesting that the Caldwell case had been understood quite differently by local residents than by the officials who had conducted the formal inquiry. Several residents admitted during these interviews that they had long suspected that something unusual was occurring at the Caldwell property, but had chosen not to investigate or report their suspicions to authorities. The reasons for this silence varied among individuals, but common themes included fear of becoming involved in what they perceived as a potentially dangerous situation, respect for the Caldwell's privacy and autonomy, and a general reluctance to challenge established patterns of behavior within their close-knit community. One particularly significant interview was conducted with Bartholomew Hutchins, the grandson of a man who had briefly worked as a hired hand for Thaddeus Caldwell in the early 1900s. According to family oral history, the elder Hutchins had quit his position abruptly after witnessing what he described as unholy activities in the basement of the Caldwell house. The specific nature of these activities had never been clearly explained to subsequent generations, but family members had been warned to avoid the Caldwell property and to discourage others from seeking employment there. The Hutchins family's story was corroborated by similar accounts from other families whose members had had employment or business relationships with the Caldwells during the early decades of the 20th century. These accounts suggested that the couple's extreme reclusion was not simply a matter of personal preference, but rather a deliberate strategy designed to prevent outsiders from observing activities that they knew would be considered unusual or inappropriate by conventional community standards. Dr. Fairfax also discovered that the Caldwell case was not entirely unique within the broader region. Her research uncovered similar incidents of unexplained disappearances and abandoned properties in neighboring counties dating back to the mid-1800s. While the specific circumstances varied, several of these cases involved elderly couples who had lived in isolation and had vanished without explanation, leaving behind well-maintained homes and no clear indication of where they might have gone. A pattern emerged when Dr. Fairfax mapped these incidents geographically and chronologically. The affected properties were consistently located in remote areas, typically on land that had been settled during the period of westward expansion following the Civil War. Many of the properties had changed hands multiple times during the late 1800s and early 1900s, often sold at prices significantly below market value, suggesting that previous owners had been eager to dispose of land that might have been associated with disturbing or traumatic events. More intriguingly, several of these properties contained architectural features similar to those found at the Caldwell house, particularly basement areas that had been modified or expanded beyond what would be necessary for simple storage purposes. While Dr. Fairfax was unable to gain access to most of these properties, public records indicated that many had eventually been demolished or had fallen into such severe disrepair that they were considered uninhabitable. The pattern of similarities among these cases suggested the possibility that the religious community described in the Caldwell Underground Journal had been more extensive than the initial entries indicated, possibly comprising a network of related settlements rather than a single isolated group. This hypothesis was supported by references in the journal to sister communities and fellow keepers of the covenant, though these references were too vague to permit definitive conclusions about the scope or organization of the broader movement. Dr. Fairfax's investigation also revealed evidence of continuing interest in the Caldwell property and similar sites by individuals and groups who claimed to be descendants or spiritual heirs of the original religious community. Several of these individuals had attempted to purchase properties associated with historical disappearances, though their efforts had generally been unsuccessful due to legal complications or community resistance to outside ownership of locally significant sites. The academic paper that Dr. Fairfax eventually published about the Caldwell case appeared in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1967 under the title Ritual Practice and Social Isolation in Post-Civil War Rural Communities. The paper focused primarily on the sociological and anthropological aspects of the case, avoiding speculation about the specific fate of the Caldwell couple while documenting the evidence of ritualistic activity and community complicity in maintaining secrecy about unusual practices. The paper's publication generated considerable interest within academic circles, particularly among researchers studying alternative religious practices and social deviance in rural American communities. Dr. Fairfax's methodology was praised for its systematic approach to documenting oral history and its careful integration of physical evidence with community testimony. However, the paper also attracted unwanted attention from individuals and groups with less scholarly motivations, including several organizations that claimed to be interested in reviving or continuing the practices that had apparently been conducted at the Caldwell property. Dr. Fairfax became increasingly concerned about the potential misuse of her research, particularly after receiving several threatening letters from individuals who accused her of violating sacred traditions or revealing information that should have remained hidden. These concerns were heightened when she learned that unauthorized visitors had been detected at the sealed Caldwell property on multiple occasions during 1968 and 1969, apparently attempting to gain access to the underground chamber that had been the focus of her investigation. The security problems at the Caldwell site reflected broader issues about the preservation and protection of historically significant properties that might also be attractive to individuals with contemporary religious or ideological interests. The county lacked resources for continuous monitoring of remote properties, and the legal status of the Caldwell land remained sufficiently ambiguous to complicate efforts to prosecute trespassers or establish clear boundaries for acceptable public access. In response to these developments, Dr. Fairfax worked with county authorities to ensure that the Caldwell property was more securely protected from unauthorized visitors. The underground chamber was permanently sealed with concrete, eliminating the possibility of future access without extensive excavation equipment and permits. The basement access was blocked with heavy steel barriers designed to prevent casual intrusion while still allowing authorized investigations if future circumstances warranted such access. Dr. Fairfax also made the controversial decision to restrict access to her research materials, donating her files to the university library with the stipulation that they would remain sealed for 50 years. This decision was criticized within academic circles, where principles of open research and scholarly transparency are highly valued, but Dr. Fairfax maintained that the potential risks associated with unrestricted access to her findings outweighed the benefits of immediate availability to other researchers. The decision to seal her research materials was influenced by Dr. Fairfax's growing awareness of the psychological impact that her investigation had had on her own mental health and well-being. In private correspondence with colleagues, she described experiencing persistent feelings of unease and a growing conviction that her investigation had somehow disturbed forces or processes that were better left undisturbed. She reported difficulty concentrating on other research projects and a general sense that she was being watched or followed, though she acknowledged that these feelings might be the result of stress and exhaustion rather than any external threat. The psychological effects of the investigation became more pronounced during the months following the completion of her fieldwork. Dr. Fairfax reported experiencing recurring nightmares about the underground chamber and the ritualistic activities that had apparently been conducted there. She also described a persistent sensation that her own home had been contaminated or altered by her exposure to the Caldwell site, leading her to undertake extensive cleaning and reorganization activities that provided only temporary relief from her anxiety. These personal experiences reinforced Dr. Fairfax's conviction that some forms of historical research might carry risks that extended beyond the conventional challenges associated with academic investigation. Her decision to restrict access to her materials was motivated by genuine concern that other researchers might experience similar psychological effects if they attempted to replicate or extend her work without adequate preparation or institutional support. The official disposition of the Caldwell case remained unchanged despite Dr. Fairfax's discoveries. County authorities determined that while her research provided interesting insights into historical practices and community dynamics, it did not constitute sufficient evidence to formally reopen the investigation into the couple's disappearance. The case files were transferred to the State Archives in Richmond, where they remained available to qualified researchers but were not actively promoted or publicized. Local memory of the Caldwell incident gradually faded as older residents passed away and new families moved into the area. The property where the house had stood became indistinguishable from the surrounding forest, as natural vegetation reclaimed the cleared areas and obscured any remaining traces of human habitation. The access road that had once led to the Caldwell house was gradually overgrown and eventually became impassable to vehicles, effectively eliminating casual access to the site. However, the case continued to exert a subtle influence on the broader community's collective memory and behavior patterns. Property values in the immediate area remained persistently lower than comparable land elsewhere in the county, though real estate agents typically attributed this to the remoteness of the location rather than any historical factors. Several attempts to develop the land for recreational or residential use were abandoned during the planning stages, often due to what developers described as unexpectedly difficult soil conditions or regulatory complications. More significantly, patterns of behavior established during the original incident continued to influence community dynamics decades later. Residents maintained an unspoken understanding that certain topics were not appropriate for casual conversation, particularly when speaking with outsiders or newcomers to the area. This culture of selective silence extended to other historical incidents and controversies, creating an environment where uncomfortable truths could be effectively suppressed without formal censorship or organized conspiracy. The psychological impact of the Caldwell case on individual community members varied considerably based on their level of involvement and personal susceptibility to stress and anxiety. Some residents reported experiencing persistent unease when traveling past the former property location, while others claimed to have entirely forgotten about the incident until reminded by researchers or journalists. A few individuals developed more severe symptoms, including sleep disturbances and recurring nightmares, though these cases were typically attributed to general life stresses rather than any specific historical trauma. Dr. Fairfax herself was not immune to the long-term psychological effects of her research. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, she continued to receive occasional letters from individuals claiming to have information about similar cases or expressing interest in continuing the research she had begun. Most of these correspondences were benign, coming from legitimate researchers or amateur historians, but some contained threats or demands that she reveal additional information about her findings. The persistent attention from these various correspondents contributed to Dr. Fairfax's decision to avoid further research into alternative religious practices or unexplained disappearances. She redirected her academic focus toward more conventional topics in social history, producing well-regarded scholarship about immigration patterns and agricultural development in Virginia. However, colleagues noted that she remained unusually reticent about discussing her early research and seemed uncomfortable when the Caldwell case was mentioned in academic contexts. As the decades passed, the Caldwell case gradually acquired the status of a local legend rather than a historical incident. Oral traditions about the disappearance evolved and diverged from the documented facts, incorporating supernatural elements and dramatic details that reflected community preferences for narrative coherence over historical accuracy. These legendary versions of the story served important social functions in transmitting cultural values about privacy, community loyalty, and the dangers of pursuing knowledge that might be better left alone. The transformation of the case from historical fact into cultural legend was facilitated by the community's continued reluctance to discuss the incident openly or to permit external investigators to examine the available evidence systematically. This pattern of protective silence ensured that sensational or speculative interpretations of the events could flourish in the absence of authoritative accounts based on careful analysis of the documented facts. By the 1990s, the Caldwell case had largely faded from both academic and public attention. The property remained in the hands of the timber company, which had no interest in its historical significance and actively discouraged visitors or researchers. The few attempts to revisit the case during this period were hampered by the destruction of the physical evidence and the death of most surviving witnesses from the original incident. However, the case experienced a brief resurgence of interest during the early 2000s when advances in forensic technology led to speculation that new evidence might be extractable from the site despite the passage of nearly 8 decades. A team of researchers from Virginia Commonwealth University obtained permission to conduct limited excavations in the area where the house had stood using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques to search for buried evidence. The VCU investigation, conducted during the summer of 2003, confirmed the presence of the original foundation and basement area, but found that the concrete ceiling of the underground chamber had been successful in preventing access to any remaining evidence. Soil samples from around the foundation showed elevated levels of various chemicals, but these could not be definitively linked to any specific historical activities due to decades of natural decomposition and contamination from forestry operations. More intriguingly, the investigation team reported experiencing several technical difficulties that seemed to exceed normal equipment failure rates. Multiple radar units malfunctioned during the survey, often displaying readings that were inconsistent with the known geology of the area. Several team members also reported feelings of disorientation and anxiety while working near the former foundation site, though these symptoms were attributed to the psychological effects of working in a location associated with disturbing historical events. The VCU team's final report, submitted to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources in 2004, concluded that the site did not contain sufficient intact historical evidence to warrant further investigation or preservation efforts. The report recommended that the property remain in private hands and that no special historical designations be applied to the land. This recommendation was accepted by state authorities, effectively closing the final official chapter in the investigation of the Caldwell case. Nevertheless, the case continued to attract occasional attention from amateur investigators, paranormal researchers, and individuals with various personal or ideological interests in the historical events. Most of these unofficial investigations were unsuccessful in accessing the actual property, but they contributed to the circulation of rumors and speculation about the case that often bore little resemblance to the documented historical facts. Social media and internet forums provided new venues for discussing the case during the 2010s, though these discussions typically focused more on sensationalized theories than on careful analysis of the available evidence. Several websites devoted to unexplained disappearances or alternative religious practices featured articles about the Caldwell case, often incorporating fictional elements or unsubstantiated claims about the nature of the ritualistic activities that had apparently been conducted at the property. The proliferation of inaccurate information about the case created challenges for serious researchers who sought to understand the historical significance of the events. Dr. Fairfax, who had retired from active teaching but maintained an interest in the case throughout her later years, expressed frustration with the distortion of her research findings and the continued attempts to exploit the case for commercial or ideological purposes. In a final interview conducted shortly before her death in 2019, Dr. Fairfax reflected on the lasting impact of her investigation and her mixed feelings about having undertaken the research. While she remained convinced that the work had contributed valuable insights into rural American history and the dynamics of social isolation, she also acknowledged that the psychological cost of the investigation had been higher than she had anticipated, and that the potential for misuse of the findings remained a source of ongoing concern. Dr. Fairfax's death marked the end of direct academic engagement with the Caldwell case by researchers who had first-hand knowledge of the original investigation and evidence. Her sealed research files remained in the university library, awaiting the expiration of the 50-year restriction period. Though the practical value of these materials for future research remained questionable, given the destruction of the physical evidence and the passage of time. The current status of the Caldwell property reflects the broader pattern of historical amnesia that characterizes many rural American communities' relationships with their more disturbing past events. The pine plantation that covers the site shows no visible evidence of its historical significance, and most current residents of Rappahannock County have little or no knowledge of the events that occurred there in 1923. Occasionally, hikers or hunters exploring the area might notice slight depressions in the forest floor that mark the location of the former foundation, but these features are easily overlooked or dismissed as natural irregularities in the terrain. The modern forestry roads that provide access to the timber plantation follow different routes that avoid the historical site entirely, ensuring that casual visitors are unlikely to encounter any reminders of the property's significance. Local real estate records continued to indicate that the area experiences lower property values than comparable forest land elsewhere in the county, though contemporary buyers and sellers are typically unaware of any historical factors that might contribute to this pattern. The timber company that owns the land has expressed no interest in selling or developing the property for other uses, citing the remote location and challenging topography as factors that limit its commercial potential beyond timber production. The broader community of Rappahannock County has maintained the culture of selective silence that was established during the original incident, though this pattern is now largely unconscious and is not specifically linked to memories of the Caldwell case. Residents continue to demonstrate reluctance to discuss certain historical topics with outsiders, and there remains an informal understanding that some questions are better left unasked and some stories are better left untold. This culture of discretion has been reinforced by the community's experience with previous attempts to exploit local history for commercial or sensational purposes. Several efforts to develop historical tourism based on the area's more dramatic past events have been met with subtle but effective resistance from local residents, who prefer to maintain their privacy and avoid attracting unwanted attention from curiosity seekers or amateur investigators. The psychological legacy of the Caldwell case continues to influence individual behavior patterns among longtime residents, though few would explicitly acknowledge this connection. Many people in the area maintain habits of avoiding certain locations or activities after dark, checking locks and security measures more frequently than might seem necessary, and maintaining closer relationships with neighbors and family members than is typical in more urban or transient communities. These behavioral patterns serve practical functions in providing security and social support within a rural environment, but they also reflect deeper psychological responses to historical trauma that has been experienced collectively by the community. The memory of the Caldwell incident, even when not consciously recalled or acknowledged, continues to shape community norms and expectations regarding appropriate levels of vigilance and mutual responsibility. As the centennial anniversary of the Caldwell disappearance approaches in 2023, there has been minimal discussion within the community about whether or how the incident should be remembered or commemorated. The few remaining residents who have direct family connections to witnesses of the original events have shown no interest in sharing their knowledge or participating in any form of historical recognition. This pattern of deliberate forgetting represents a collective decision by the community to prioritize present security and comfort over historical accuracy or completeness. While this approach has been successful in preventing exploitation of the case and protecting residents from unwanted attention, it has also ensured that important insights into rural American history and the dynamics of social isolation may be permanently lost. The ultimate significance of the Caldwell case may lie not in the specific details of what happened to Thaddeus and Cordelia Caldwell in October 1923, but in the broader patterns of community response that their disappearance revealed. The case demonstrated how small, isolated communities can collectively suppress uncomfortable truths how individual psychological pressures can escalate into destructive behaviors, and how historical trauma can continue to influence social dynamics across multiple generations. Perhaps most importantly, the case illustrated the complex ethical challenges facing researchers who study sensitive or potentially dangerous historical practices. Dr. Fairfax's experience demonstrated that the pursuit of historical knowledge cannot be divorced from considerations of present safety and social responsibility, and that some truths may carry costs that exceed their academic or social value. Today, the forest that covers the Caldwell property stands as a living monument to these themes of secrecy, survival, and the price of knowledge. The trees have grown tall and strong over the buried foundations and sealed chambers, their roots extending deep into soil that holds memories it cannot speak and secrets it will never reveal. In the silence of that forest, where even the wind seems to whisper more softly than elsewhere, the past maintains its grip on the present through the simple but powerful mechanism of things left unsaid and questions left unasked. The Caldwell case reminds us that every community, no matter how small or remote, harbors complexities that resist easy explanation and truths that challenge comfortable assumptions about human nature and social cooperation. Some houses, once they have been lived in, leave impressions that outlast their physical existence. Some families, once they have made their choices, cast shadows that extend far beyond their own lives. And some stories, once they have begun to be told, continue to unfold in ways that their original participants never anticipated or intended.